The Byzantine Empire. Faith, ritual, and sacred power. Deep dive. How one empire made Christianity civilization. The theology of divine kingship. The mysticism of sacred light. Icons, relics, heresies, and the rites that held a 1,000-year world together. There's a reality saints may imbi haliniti 11.6. Procure. Contents. Introduction, what Byzantium actually was. Part 1, From Rome to the New Rome, Constantine and the Christian Empire. Part 2, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the theological heart. Part 3, the Trinity debates, councils, creeds, and holy war over words. Part 4, the Emperor as sacred figure, Basilius and the divine order. Part 5, the liturgy, the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Part 6, sacred space, the church as heaven on earth. Part 7, icons, theology in color and gold. Part 8, the iconoclast crisis, can God be depicted? Part 9, relics, miracles, and the living power of the holy. Part 10, monasticism, the desert fathers, Mount Athos, and the inner life. Part 11, hesychasm, the mysticism of divine light. Part 12, the sacred calendar, feast days and the Byzantine year. Part 13, death, burial, and the Byzantine afterlife. Part 14, folk religion, magic, and the unofficial sacred. Part 15, the fall of Constantinople and what was lost. Part 16, Byzantine legacy and haligicity, where the paths cross. Introduction. Most people in the Western world have heard the word Byzantine and associated it with complexity, bureaucratic intricacy, or political scheming. That usage tells us something about how thoroughly the actual civilization of Byzantium has been erased from Western cultural memory, because the real Byzantine Empire was one of the most remarkable, sophisticated, and spiritually rich civilizations in human history. The Byzantine Empire was the direct continuation of the Roman Empire after its western half collapsed in 476. It endured for another 1,000 years, from its formal establishment under Constantine the Great to the Ottoman conquest of that city in 1453. During those 1,000 years it was the dominant power of the Mediterranean and Near East, the primary custodian of classical Greco-Roman knowledge, and the civilization that gave the world Eastern Orthodox Christianity in its fully developed form. What defined Byzantium above all else was its understanding of the relationship between the divine and the political. For the Byzantines, there was no meaningful separation between sacred and secular. The emperor was God's vicegerent on earth. The liturgy was heaven enacted in time. The city of Constantinople was the earthly image of the heavenly Jerusalem. Every aspect of Byzantine public and private life was oriented toward the sacred, and the specific form that sacred orientation took was Christianity of extraordinary theological depth, mystical intensity, liturgical beauty, and political consequence. This guide is a complete exploration of what the Byzantines believed, how they worshipped, what their rituals meant, and how a civilization built on such vision of the sacred lasted 1,000 years. And heavy understanding it matters for anyone walking a synthesized spiritual path today. From Rome to the New Rome, Constantine and the Christian Empire. The conversion that changed history. In 312 CE, the Roman general Constantine was marching toward Rome to fight his rival Maxentius for control of the Western Empire. According to the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, on the eve of the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine received the vision, cross of light in the air with the words in Hoth signo vinces, in this sign, conquer. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Chirho symbol, won the battle decisively, and entered Rome as undisputed Western emperor. Whether the vision was literal, symbolic, or politically calculated is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is its consequence. Constantine became the first Roman emperor to publicly embrace Christianity, issued the Edict of Milan in 313, guaranteeing religious tolerance throughout the empire, and over the following decades actively promoted Christianity from the persecuted minority religion to the empire's favored faith. At the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity was the official state religion of Rome, and all other religions were officially illegal. Constantinople, the city built for God. In 330 CE, Constantine dedicated a new capital city on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the strategically perfect location where Europe meets Asia at the Bosphorus Strait. He called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and understood it as a specifically Christian city from its foundation. While Rome was built on pagan foundations that had to be subsequently Christianized, Constantinople was built from the ground up as a holy city. Its churches, layout, relics, and mythology were all Christian from the beginning. Constantinople was understood by its inhabitants not merely as a capital but as a sacred city, the earthly reflection of the heavenly Jerusalem. Protected by the Theotokos, whose icon was carried in processions on the city walls whenever it was threatened by enemies. The city's survival through centuries of sieges used Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russians was taken as constant miraculous confirmation of divine protection. When it finally fell in 1453, the shock to the Christian world was theological as much as political. The protected city had fallen, and the age it had sustained was over. The problem of two empires. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines. That name was given them by later Western scholars. They called themselves Romans and their empire the Roman Empire. They considered themselves the direct, legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire's collapse in 476 was, from the Byzantine perspective, temporary disruption in the provinces, not the end of Rome. This self-understanding had profound religious implications. The Roman Empire, in Byzantine theology, was not just a political entity, it was an institution with divinely ordained role in sacred history. The empire was the providential context within which Christianity had been planted, had grown, and from which it would spread to all peoples before the end of time. The emperor was not merely a political leader but the guardian of the conditions within which salvation was possible. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the theological heart. Byzantine religion was Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and to understand Byzantium you must understand what orthodoxy actually is, which is significantly different from both Western Catholicism and Protestant Christianity. What orthodox means? Orthodox means both correct belief and correct worship. The word doxa is crucial. It means not just opinion or doctrine but glory, the radiant, visible splendor of God. Orthodox Christianity is therefore not merely about holding the right theological propositions. It is about participating in the right form of divine glorification, worshiping in the way that most truly and completely gives God glory and through which God's glory most truly and completely enters the worshiping community. This understanding makes Byzantine Orthodox practice fundamentally different from Western approaches to Christianity that privilege doctrine, personal conviction, or moral behavior as the primary markers of authentic faith. For orthodoxy, the liturgy bathes the theology. You do not learn what the church believes by reading a catechism. You learn it through participating in the divine liturgy, where the entire drama of creation, fall, incarnation, death, resurrection, and final glorification is enacted every week in a form of extraordinary sensory and theological completeness. Theosis, deification as the goal of human life. The central concept of Orthodox theology, and the one that most distinguishes it from Western Christianity, is theosis, the deification of the human person. Theosis is the teaching that the purpose of human life is not merely to be forgiven, or to follow moral rules, or to believe correct doctrines, but to be progressively transformed into the likeness of God, to participate in the divine nature itself. The foundational statement of this teaching comes from Saint Athanasius of Alexandria. God became human so that humans might become God. This is not metaphor or hyperbole. Orthodox theology teaches with full seriousness that the created human person is capable of genuine, real participation in the uncreated divine life, not becoming God in essence, but participating in God's energies, the radiant, living activities through which God is present and active in creation. The distinction between essence and energies. The theological distinction between divine essence and divine energies is the most important and distinctive contribution of Byzantine theological thought. Developed most fully by Saint Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, it holds that while God's inner being is absolutely transcendent and unknowable, God's energies, His love, His light, His life, His wisdom as they actually operate in the world, are genuinely present and participable with created beings. This distinction allowed Byzantine theology to affirm simultaneously that God is absolutely transcendent and absolutely immanent. The deified saint genuinely encounters and participates in the real divine life, the actual uncreated light of God, while remaining finite creature. Connection to haligicity. The orthodox teaching of theosis, that the purpose of human life is genuine transformation into divine likeness, participation in the uncreated divine energies, is one of the most direct ancient Christian expressions of what haligicity holds as the foundational reality, that the human being is not separate from the divine and is capable of real, lived participation in divine consciousness. Advaita Vedanta calls it Atman equals Brahman. Rastafari calls it I and I. The Heliopolitan tradition calls it the Ak. Orthodox Christianity calls it Theosis. The names are different. The recognition is the same. The essence energy's distinction also resonates with the haligric understanding that the source is forever beyond complete conceptual grasp, but its living activity is fully and experientially accessible. The Trinity debates councils, creeds, and holy war over words. The most distinctive and politically consequential feature of Byzantine religious culture was the intensity with which ordinary people, not just theologians, cared about extremely specific theological propositions. The question of whether Christ was fully divine or a created being, whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from both Father and Son, whether Mary should be called Theotokos or merely Christotokos. These were not academic disputes. They were street-level controversies in which riots occurred, emperors were deposed, and schisms fractured the church. The 7 ecumenical councils. Between 325 CE and 787 CE, the Byzantine Church held 7 councils that it considers ecumenical and whose decisions it regards as binding, permanent, and spirit-guided. These councils defined the precise theological content of Orthodox Christianity, and their definitions were not mere intellectual exercises, but the outcomes of bitter, generation-spanning controversies. Nikaya Z. Against Arianism. Arius of Alexandria had taught that the Son of God was created being, the highest of all creatures, but not co-eternal and co-equal with the Father. The Council declared this heresy and affirmed that the Son is homoousios, of the same substance as the Father. This is the foundational statement of Trinitarian orthodoxy and the basis of the Nicene Creed recited in every Orthodox liturgy to this day. Constantinople I. Against Macedonianism, which denied the full divinity of the Holy Spirit. The Council completed the Nicene Creed with the affirmation that the Holy Spirit is worshipped and glorified together with the Father and the Son. The Trinity is fully defined, 3 persons, 1 substance, co-equal and co-eternal. Eva the theological intensity. To a modern reader it can seem strange that anyone would riot in the streets over the precise relationship between the Father and the Son. But for the Byzantines, the theological stakes were genuinely existential. If Christ was not fully divine, then the incarnation could not bridge the gap between God and humanity, and theosis was impossible. If Christ was not fully human, then human nature was not genuinely assumed and he'll divide the divine, and human salvation was illusory. Every theological definition was simultaneously a statement about what human beings are capable of and what the divine has actually done in history. The emperor as sacred figure Basilius and the divine order. One of the most distinctive and theologically significant aspects of Byzantine civilization was its understanding of imperial authority. The Byzantine emperor was not merely a political leader who happened to be Christian. He was a sacred figure whose office was understood as divinely ordained and theologically necessary. The theology of imperial authority. The Byzantine political theology began with the Eusebian concept of the emperor as the earthly image of the divine Logos. Just as the Logos governs the cosmos, bringing order out of chaos and maintaining the harmony of the heavenly realm, so the emperor governs the earthly realm as the Logos vicegerent, bringing divine order into human affairs, protecting the church, and creating the conditions within which all people can pursue salvation. The emperor's title was Basilius, from the 5th century onward, specifically Basilius, an autocrator of the Romans, anointed of the Lord. He was anointed at his coronation Eli the Patriarch of Constantinople in ceremony that deliberately paralleled the Old Testament anointing of kings. His purple robes, Byzantine purple, produced from the murex nail at extraordinary expense and reserved exclusively for the imperial family, were the color of divinity, the same purple that adorned the images of Christ and the saints in the mosaics of Hagia Sophia. The emperor in the liturgy. The emperor's sacred status was expressed most completely in his specific liturgical role. He was the only layperson permitted to enter the sanctuary of the church. He received communion with the clergy at the altar rather than with the laity at the nave. He preached on certain feast days. He presided over church councils, not as a theological authority, but as the divinely appointed protector of conciliar order. The imperial presence at liturgy was not ceremonial courtesy, it was theologically necessary. The symphony of church and empire. Western scholars have often described the Byzantine relationship between emperor and church as Caesaropapism, the emperor dominating the church. The reality was more complex. In theory, the emperor governed worldly affairs, while the patriarch governed spiritual ones, a symphonia of two complementary authorities, like soul and body, that together constituted the well-ordered Christian commonwealth. In practice, the relationship was constantly negotiated, contested, and occasionally explosive. Some emperors defined theological positions and compelled the church to accept them. Some patriarchs excommunicated emperors. The iconoclast controversy featured emperors violently suppressing monasteries and exiling patriarchs. The symphonia was an ideal that both parties invoked constantly and that neither fully achieved, which is precisely why it remained generative as a concept rather than collapsing into either theocracy or anticlerical secularism. The liturgy, the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. At the absolute center of Byzantine religious life was the divine liturgy, the Eucharistic service celebrated every Sunday and on major feast days in every church across the empire. Understanding the Byzantine liturgy is understanding Byzantium, because for the Byzantines, the liturgy was not religious service, it was the actual entry of heaven into time, the participation of the gathered community in the eternal worship of the divine throne. The basic structure. The divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is still the primary liturgical form of the Eastern Orthodox Church today, celebrated in largely the same form as it was 1,000 years ago in Byzantium. It consists of two major parts, the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the faithful. The liturgy of the Word includes the opening litanies, the singing of the antiphons, the little entrance, the reading of the epistle and gospel, and the homily. The liturgy of the faithful includes the great entrance, the creed, the anaphora, the consecration at the epiclesis, and the reception of communion. The theological experience. To attend the Byzantine liturgy is to enter a total sensory environment designed to communicate, through every available channel, the reality of divine presence. The church building itself is an icon of the cosmos. The golden mosaics shimmer with a light that seems to come from within. The incense fills the air with fragrance understood as the prayers of the saints. The chanting, Byzantine chant, monophonic and modal, capable of extraordinary emotional depth, carries the psalms and the logical texts through the body's hearing into the heart. The Byzantine theologian Nicholas Kabasilas described the liturgy as a dramatic enactment of the entire economy of salvation. The entire story of God's relationship with humanity from creation through incarnation to resurrection and final glorification, enacted in miniature in every celebration. The priest acts in the person of Christ, the deacon represents the angels, the people are the whole of redeemed humanity. The liturgy is heaven on earth, entered through the threshold of the church door. The anaphora, the central prayer. The anaphora of St. John Chrysostom begins with dialogue between priest and people. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord. It is meet and right. This exchange establishes that what follows is not priestly performance for passive audience, but genuinely communal act of approach to the divine. The anaphora moves through a series of interconnected thanksgivings for creation, for reason, for the covenant, for the prophets, for the incarnation, for the death and resurrection of Christ, for the gift of the Spirit. It reaches its climax in the epiclesis, the invocation of the Holy Spirit to descend on the gifts, and in the great intercession for the living and the dead, in which the gathered community stands before God as the whole of humanity, past and present. Connection po haligrisity. The Byzantine liturgy's understanding of itself as the entry of heaven into time, the moment when the eternal and the temporal meet, is the most complete ancient Christian expression of what haligrisity holds about sacred ceremony. The Haligric Book of Rituals understands every ceremony as an opening of sacred space, in which the ordinary rules of time and separation are suspended and something genuinely other becomes genuinely present. The Byzantine practice of opening the ceremony with the mutual recognition of sacred standing, priest and people affirming together that what follows is genuine divine encounter, resonates directly with the Haligric understanding that ritual requires the conscious participation of all present, not merely the performance of designated specialists. Sacred space, the church as heaven on earth. Byzantine church architecture is one of the most theologically deliberate built environments in human history. Every element, its orientation, its spatial organization, its decoration communicates a specific theological understanding of the relationship between heaven and earth, time and eternity, the human and the divine. The cosmic symbolism of the church building. A Byzantine church is oriented east-west, the altar at the east, toward the rising sun. The nave is the earthly realm, the place of the gathered faithful, the world of time and matter sanctified by the presence of God. The sanctuary is the heavenly realm where the divine liturgy is performed, where the consecration occurs, where heaven and earth most fully meet. The dome, the defining architectural feature of Byzantine church design, is the heaven above. In the center of the dome, Byzantine churches typically place the image of Christ as Pantocrator, magnificent face looking down from the dome's apex, surrounded by the heavenly hosts. To stand in the nave of a great Byzantine church and look upward is to look into heaven, to see the divine face looking back from above, with the angels and saints arrayed around it, and the whole of sacred history depicted on the walls below in mosaic and fresco. Hagia Sophia, heaven realized in stone. The supreme expression of Byzantine sacred architecture is Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, built by the Emperor Justinian and dedicated in 537. At its dedication, Justinian reportedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," claiming to have built a house of God greater than the temple in Jerusalem. Hagia Sophia's enormous central dome appears to hover miraculously above the nave, supported by a ring of 40 windows at its base through which light flows in and creates the impression that the dome is floating on light, suspended from heaven rather than resting on earth. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the dome appeared to be suspended from heaven via a golden chain. The floating light, the golden mosaics, the sheer scale of the space, all work together to create an environment in which the boundary between heaven and earth is genuinely dissolved in aesthetic experience. The iconostasis, the sacred threshold. Separating the nave from the sanctuary is the iconostasis, screen covered with icons, typically 3 tiers high, with 3 doors. The central doors are opened at specific moments in the liturgy when the gospel book is processed, when the great entrance brings the gifts to the altar, when the priest emerges to give communion, and closed at others. The iconostasis is not a wall that hides the sacred from the people. It is a threshold, the boundary between the earthly and the heavenly that is permeable at the liturgical moments when heaven most fully enters earth. Icon's theology in color and gold. The icon is the most characteristic and theologically rich art form of Byzantine civilization, and one of the most misunderstood. An icon is not a religious picture. It is not primarily an artistic object. It is a theological statement about the nature of divine presence and the capacity of matter to communicate the sacred. What an icon is. The word icon simply means image or likeness. In Byzantine theological usage, an icon is a sacred image of Christ, the Virgin Mary, a saint, or a sacred event that is understood to genuinely participate in the sacred reality it depicts. The icon is not merely a reminder of a holy person or event, it is genuine locus of that person's or event's spiritual presence, threshold through which the depicted reality is actually accessible. The theological basis for this claim rests on the incarnation. If God genuinely became human, took on material form, physical body that could be seen, touched, and depicted, then matter is capable of bearing the divine. The incarnation is the ultimate icon, God in human flesh. And if the prototype is genuinely depictable, then images of that prototype and of those united with God through theosis are genuinely capable of communicating His presence. How icons are made. Icon writing traditionally required spiritual preparation, fasting, prayer, and confession before beginning work. The wooden panel was prepared with multiple layers of gesso, surface that is both absorbent and luminous. The paints were mineral-based, earth pigments, ground semi-precious stones, mixed with egg yolk whose organic protein base gives the finished surface its characteristic depth and warmth. The gold background of icons, the field of uncreated divine light against which all the figures are depicted, is not a decorative element. It is the theological subject of the icon, the uncreated light of God that permeates and surrounds all who participate in theosis. The saint is not depicted in a specific earthly location because the saint is no longer bound to earthly location, they exist in the divine light that is beyond time and space. The gold background is not gold. It is eternity. The theological distinction, veneration, neck worship. The Second Council of Nicaea drew the critical distinction that Orthodox theology maintains to this day. icons are to be venerated but not worshipped, with the worship due to God alone. The honor given to the icon passes to the prototype, the holy person depicted. In practice, Byzantine devotion to icons was intense and intimate. Icons were kissed, carried in procession, held before sick people as objects of healing, placed at the bedside of the dying, invoked for protection in battle. The most sacred icons were understood as miraculous, capable of healing, of protecting in battle, of active spiritual presence in the community's life. Connection po haligrisity. The Byzantine theology of the icon that matter is capable of genuinely bearing and communicating divine presence, because God genuinely entered matter in the incarnation, is one of the most complete ancient articulations of what haligricity's crystal and sacred object practices operate on. The haligric understanding that physical objects can be intentionally charged with specific energetic states rests on the same foundational recognition as the Byzantine icon theology, that matter is not spiritually inert. The incarnation is the Christian version of the recognition that every tradition honors, that the divine is not confined to the non-material but is fully present in and through the material world. The haligric practitioner who holds charged crystal is making the same theological move as the Byzantine believer who kisses an icon, honoring the invisible through the visible, acknowledging that the boundary between matter and spirit is permeable. The iconoclast crisis: can God be depicted? The greatest internal religious crisis of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most consequential theological controversies in Christian history, was iconoclasm. The movement to destroy all sacred images on the grounds that depicting Christ and the saints was idolatrous. The first iconoclasm. In 726 CE, Emperor Liu Dai ordered the removal of the famous Christ icon from the Chalk Gate, the main entrance to the imperial palace in Constantinople. The reaction was violent, crowds rioted, imperial soldiers were killed, and women of the city reportedly formed human barrier around the icon. His son Constantine pursued iconoclasm even more aggressively, holding council that declared icon veneration heretical and actively persecuting monks and others who defended icons. The theological argument of the iconoclasts was sophisticated. God is incorporeal, beyond all human representation, and any attempt to depict him necessarily reduces him to a finite, material form. To venerate such depiction is to commit the idolatry condemned throughout the Hebrew scriptures. The victory of Christianity over paganism had been precisely the victory of the invisible, spiritual God over the material gods of stone and wood. Iconoclasm was, in its own view, the completion of that victory. The iconophile response. The defenders of icons, the iconophiles, were led intellectually by Saint John of Damascus, who wrote from outside the Byzantine Empire, and whose 3 treatises against those who attack the divine images are among the most important works of Byzantine theology. His argument turned on the incarnation. Before the incarnation, the iconoclast argument would have been valid. God is spirit, invisible, indescribable. But in the incarnation, the invisible became visible, the indescribable took on describable face. To refuse to depict Christ is to deny the incarnation, to suggest that his human form was not real or not permanent. The icon is possible because of the incarnation and necessary as a defense of it. The first iconoclasm ended in 787 CE with the 7th Ecumenical Council at Nicaea, which restored icon veneration. A second iconoclasm was followed by a final restoration of icons in 843 SE, celebrated to this day in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy, observed on the first Sunday of Great Lent. Relics, miracles, and the living power of the holy. In Byzantine religious life, the boundary between the visible and the invisible world was understood as genuinely thin, and in specific places, objects, and persons, thinner than usual. The practice of relic veneration, miraculous healing, and the active presence of the saints in daily life was not the folk religion of uneducated masses, but the fully integrated theological conviction of the Byzantine world at all levels of society. What relic is and how it matters. A relic is a physical remnant of a holy person, their body, a portion of it, their clothing, or objects that had been in intimate contact with them. For Byzantine theology, relics were not merely commemorative objects or symbols of the holy person's memory. They were genuine points of the saint's continued presence in the material world. The theological rationale is the same as that of the icon. If matter is capable of bearing the divine, then the body of a person who has been genuinely united with God through theosis does not cease to be a vehicle of divine presence merely because the person has died. Constantinople as relic repository. Constantinople was the greatest relic repository in the ancient and medieval world. Over the centuries, Byzantine emperors and ecclesiastical authorities accumulated an extraordinary collection: the True Cross, the Crown of Thorns, the Holy Lance, the Holy Sponge, the Mandilion, and relics of hundreds of saints, including the bodies of major apostles. This accumulation was not merely religious hoarding, it was geopolitical and theological strategy. The city that possessed the most sacred objects was the most sacred city. When the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1200 CE, an event of traumatic sacrilege that permanently shattered Byzantine Western Christian relations, the greatest prize the Crusaders carried back to Western Europe was precisely the relic collection. Churches across France, Germany, and Italy still house Byzantine relics acquired in 1200. Miraculous icons and wonder-working saints. Byzantine religious life was saturated with miracles, not as exceptional intrusions of the divine into the ordinary, but as the normal consequence of living in a world where the divine was genuinely present and active. Icons wept blood or emitted fragrance. Saints appeared in dreams to heal the sick or warn of danger. Churches were protected from fire or earthquake by divine intervention. Holy water from blessed springs cured diseases. The most famous Byzantine miracle collections, the miracles of Saint Demetrius and the miracles of Saints Cosmas and Damian, document an extraordinary range of healings: paralysis, blindness, fever, mental illness, infertility, plague, monasticism, the Desert Fathers, Mount Athos, and the inner life. If the liturgy was the heart of Byzantine public religious life, monasticism was its soul. Byzantine monasticism produced some of the most important Christian mystical literature in any tradition and created communities that were simultaneously the empire's most important centers of prayer, learning, manuscript preservation, and spiritual formation. The origins: Desert Fathers and Mothers. Christian monasticism originated in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when men and women began withdrawing from the cities to the desert, literally and metaphorically, to pursue an undistracted life of prayer, fasting, and combat with the passions. The most famous of the early monastics was Saint Anthony the Great, whose biography, Athanasius, became one of the most widely read texts in the ancient world and defined the model of the Christian ascetic. The Desert Fathers and Mothers developed a rich, practical, psychologically acute tradition of spiritual guidance, preserved in the Apophthegmata Patrum. These sayings are not theological treatises, but direct, often paradoxical wisdom drawn from lived experience. Brother, ask Abba Moses for your word. The old man said to him, "Go and sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." The desert tradition emphasized the transformation of the inner life through the sustained practice of watchfulness, humility, and the prayer of the heart, and this tradition flowed directly into Byzantine monasticism. Cenobitic and eremitic monasticism. Byzantine monasticism developed two primary forms. Cenobitic monasticism organized monks in communities under common rule and a spiritual father. All property was held in common. All members followed the same daily schedule of prayer, work, and study. Saint Basil the Great's monastic rules became the foundation of Cenobitic Orthodox monasticism and remain in use today. Hermetic monasticism, the life of the hermit or solitary, was the more ancient and more prestigious form. The solitary monk, living alone in a cell or cave, practicing unceasing prayer and absolute simplicity of life, was the Byzantine ideal of human existence. Stripped of every distraction, the person stands before God in transparent nakedness, engaging in the fundamental work of becoming what every human being is called to become. Mount Athos, the Holy Mountain. The most important monastic complex in the Byzantine world, and still living monastic community today, is Mount Athos, the peninsula in northern Greece dedicated entirely to monastic life since the 9th century. Women have been prohibited from entering Athos since the Byzantine period. The peninsula is under the special protection of the Theotokos, and no other woman is permitted in her sacred territory. At its medieval peak, Mount Athos housed tens of thousands of monks in 20 main monasteries and hundreds of smaller communities. The libraries of Athos contain some of the most important manuscript collections in the world: Byzantine theological, philosophical, and liturgical texts preserved through centuries of Ottoman rule. Connection to Haligrisity. The Byzantine monastic tradition's understanding of the inner life, the transformation of the person through sustained practice, the combat with the passions, The cultivation of watchfulness and prayer until the heart is genuinely changed is one of the most complete ancient Christian expressions of what haligrisity holds about inner work. The Desert Father aphorism, "Sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything," is the monastic equivalent of the Haligric understanding that the deepest wisdom is not found by acquiring more information, but by creating the conditions for something that is already present to be heard. The nepsis of the Desert tradition, the sustained, compassionate, non-reactive attention to what is actually happening in one's inner life, parallels the Haligric practitioner's relationship to the feeling dimension of the tetrality. Hesychasm, the mysticism of divine light. The highest expression of Byzantine Christian mysticism and the theological achievement that most clearly distinguishes Orthodox spirituality from Western Christianity is hesychasm, the tradition of interior prayer aimed at the direct experiential encounter with the uncreated divine light. What hesychasm is? Hesychasm is the practice of inner stillness, the progressive quieting of the mind's ordinary activity until the practitioner reaches state of pure, attentive openness in which the divine light becomes directly perceptible. It is not a technique for relaxation or stress reduction. It is a way of encountering God in a mode that transcends conceptual thought of knowing God not by thinking about Him, but by being present to His uncreated light in direct, unmediated experience. The Jesus Prayer. The central practice of hesychasm is the Jesus Prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, sinner. This short prayer, sometimes called the prayer of the heart, is repeated continuously, coordinated with the breath, until it descends from the level of words mentally repeated into a state in which the prayer prays itself. The practitioner is no longer saying the words, but living within a field of ongoing divine invocation that no longer requires conscious attention to maintain. The coordination of the prayer with the breath, and eventually with the heartbeat, reflects the hesychast understanding that the whole person, body as well as mind, must participate in prayer. The body is not distraction from spiritual practice, but its proper vehicle. The goal is not to escape the body but to pray with the whole body, to allow the prayer to fill the practitioner's entire embodied existence until the boundary between the act of prayer and the state of being becomes transparent. The Tabor light. The specific experience that hesychasm aims at is the direct perception of the Tabor light, the uncreated divine light that Christ's disciples perceived when He was transfigured on Mount Tabor. In the Transfiguration narrative, Christ's face shone like the sun and His garments became white as light. The hesychast tradition holds that this light was not a physical phenomenon. It was the uncreated divine energy of God, made visible in that moment to prepare human perception. Saint Gregory Palamas developed the most complete theological defense of this teaching, that the Tabor light is genuinely uncreated, that it was genuinely perceived by the disciples, and that it is still accessible to prepared human perception through the practice of hesychast prayer. Advanced practitioners of the Jesus Prayer have reported the direct perception of inner light that they identify with the Tabor light, light that has no external source, that fills the perception from within, and that is accompanied by profound peace, clarity, and a sense of the complete adequacy of the present moment. The hesychast controversy. In the 14th na century, the hesychast tradition became the subject of a fierce theological controversy when the Calabrian philosopher Barlaam attacked the hesychast claim that created humans can directly perceive the uncreated divine light. His argument, the uncreated and the created are categorically different, and no bridge between them is possible. The Palamate response, defending the real, uncreated character of the light and the real capacity of the deified person to perceive it, produced the greatest work of systematic Orthodox theology, Palamas' Triads in Defense of the Holy Hesychasts. A series of councils in Constantinople affirmed the Palamite theology as the teaching of the Orthodox Church. Connection to haligricity. Hesychasm is the Byzantine Christian tradition that comes closest to what the world's deepest mystical traditions across all cultures are pointing at, the direct, experiential, non-conceptual encounter with the divine light or consciousness that is the ground of all existence. The Advaita Vedanta teacher who points to pure awareness before all thought. The Taoist sage who returns to the stillness of Wuchai. The Buddhist practitioner who rests in Rigpa. The Sufi mystic who speaks of Fana. The hesychast who perceives the Tabor light in the prayer of the heart. These are different traditions approaching the same recognition. Haligricity holds that this convergence is not coincidence, it is multiple independent confirmations of the same fundamental reality. The Haligric practitioner who works with breath, with inner stillness, with the sustained cultivation of present moment awareness is walking the hesychast path, give another name. The sacred calendar, feast days, and the Byzantine year. For the Byzantines, time itself was sacred, not neutral medium in which events happened, but divinely structured reality in which the entire drama of salvation was reenacted every year in the cycle of liturgical feasts. The Byzantine sacred calendar organized the year around 12 major feasts, plus the weekly Sunday celebration of the resurrection, the seasons of fasting and feasting, and the daily commemoration of saints. The 12 great feasts. The Dodecaorton, the 12 great feasts of the Byzantine liturgical year, each celebrate a specific event in the life of Christ or the Virgin Mary. They are not merely anniversaries of historical events. They are understood as the annual re-entry of those events into the present, each feast making sacramentally real the event it celebrates. The Nativity of the Theotokos. The birth of the Virgin Mary, the event that prepared the vessel through which God would enter history. The Byzantine calendar begins its liturgical year on September Isa, and the Nativity of Mary on September 8 is thus the first major feast of the new year. The beginning of the story of salvation starts with the birth of the one who will be God. The elevation of the Holy Cross. The finding and elevation of the true cross, Eva Saint Helen, mother of Constantine. The faithful prostrate before the cross 3 times, gesture of reverence for the instrument of salvation. Basil, the herb of the holy, is blessed and distributed to the faithful on this feast day. The presentation of the Theotokos. Mary's presentation in the temple as a child, where she lived in the inner sanctuary, her preparation and consecration as the holy vessel of the Incarnation. The Nativity of Christ. Christmas, understood in Byzantine theological depth not primarily as celebration of the baby Jesus, but as the cosmic event of the Creator entering His creation. Byzantine Christmas hymnody is among the most theologically rich in any Christian tradition. Theophany, Epiphany. The baptism of Christ, the moment when the Trinity is revealed simultaneously. The Father speaks from heaven, the Son is baptized in the Jordan, the Spirit descends as a dove. The great blessing of waters is performed at Theophany. Water blessed on this day is understood to carry healing power for the entire year. In Byzantium, the emperor threw a gold cross into the waters in great public ceremony. The presentation of Christ in the temple. The ritual presentation of the Apatnapu, the old Christ in the temple, where the elder Simeon recognizes him and sings the Nunc Dimittis. Candlelight processions mark this feast, a feast of light in the heart of winter. The Annunciation. The Archangel Gabriel's announcement to Mary that she will conceive the Son of God. Byzantine theology understands Mary's response as the precise moment of the Incarnation. March 25 is exactly 9 months before December 25. The theological logic is the Incarnation, not the birth, as the supreme mystery. Palm Sunday. Christ's entry into Jerusalem. Byzantine custom involved the entire congregation processing with palm and willow branches, a reenactment of the crowd's reception of the king. The Ascension of Christ, Apatnapu days after Pascha. Christ's bodily return to the heavenly realm, human nature raised to sit at the right hand of the Father, completing the Incarnation's full hours. Pentecost. The descent of the Holy Spirit on the apostles, the birthday of the Church. The most elaborate decorative use of green branches and flowers of the entire liturgical year. Pentecost involves 3 long kneeling prayers, the only kneeling permitted throughout the paschal season. The Transfiguration. The revelation of Christ's divine glory on Mount Tabor. The Feast of the Hesychasts, the annual liturgical celebration of the uncreated Tabor light that is the goal of all Byzantine mystical practice. Grapes and other fruits are brought to church to be blessed on this day. The Dormition of the Theotokos. The death and bodily assumption of the Virgin Mary, called the Dormition rather than death, reflecting the Orthodox understanding that she who bore life could not be held pure death. The most important Marian feast of the Byzantine year, preceded Gioi, 2-week fast and celebrated with extraordinary liturgical solemnity. Pascha, the Feast of Feasts. Above all 12 great feasts, and above all other celebrations of the liturgical year, stands Pascha, the Orthodox Easter, the feast of the resurrection of Christ. Pascha is not simply the most important feast, it is, in Byzantine theology, the event that gives all other feasts their meaning. Every Sunday is a little Pascha. Every Eucharist is Paschal celebration. The entire liturgical year circles around Pascha as the planets circle the sun. The paschal vigil, the all-night service beginning in darkness and ending in the blaze of light, and the proclamation, Christ is risen, is the most complete liturgical experience in the Byzantine tradition. The entire church is in darkness. At midnight, the priest lights a single candle from the eternal flame in the sanctuary and processes to the doors of the church, where the congregation waits outside. The flame is shared from candle to candle until the darkness is filled with individual lights. The doors are opened. The proclamation is made. The church breaks into the paschal troparion. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death, yields death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. The fasting seasons. The Byzantine liturgical year was also structured by 4 major fasting seasons: Great Lent, the Apostles' Fast, the Dormition Fast, and the Nativity Fast. Wednesday and Friday were also fast days throughout the year, in memory of the betrayal and crucifixion of Christ. The fasting calendar structured time as a curriculum of intensification and release of preparation and celebration that organized the entire community's physical and spiritual life around the sacred year. Death, burial, and the Byzantine afterlife. Byzantine Christianity's understanding of death, burial, and what comes after was one of the most complete and consistent in the ancient world, embedded in a set of ritual practices that expressed with remarkable specificity what the community believed about the relationship between the living and the dead. The moment of death. It was change in mode of for Byzantine Christians. Death was not the end of relationship. The dying person was attended by the priest who administered the final mysteries, unction, confession, and communion. These sacramental acts prepared the soul for the moment of departure from the body, not magically guaranteeing safe passage, but placing the dying person consciously within the community of the church, whose prayers would continue to accompany them beyond death. The moment of death was called the exodus, the departure, the going out. The imagery was explicitly exodus-shaped, the soul departing the Egypt of the body and moving toward the promised land of the kingdom. The priest would read the canon for the departure of the soul, prayers and vitins that accompanied the dying person through the threshold and addressed the soul directly in its new condition of freedom from the body. Burial practices. Byzantine burial was always in the earth, conviction that the body would be resurrected at the final judgment, and that the body's material integrity was to be respected as the former home of the Holy Spirit. The body was washed, wrapped in a white shroud, and placed in the coffin with hands crossed on the chest, holding an icon or cross. Cremation was not practiced, reflecting the theological. Commemorations of the dead occurred at regular intervals, the 3rd day after death, the 9th day, the 40th day, and annually thereafter. On these occasions, koliva was prepared, a dish of boiled wheat mixed with nuts, raisins, and spices, decorated with cross symbolizing Christ's word that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. The koliva was blessed at church and shared among the community, communion of the living with the dead. The intermediate state and prayer for the dead. Byzantine popular theology described the journey of the soul after death through a series of aerial toll houses, intermediate stations at which the soul was examined concerning specific categories of sin. This is not official dogma, but represents a widely shared Byzantine understanding of the post-death journey as a process rather than an instantaneous passage. The final destination is not fixed until the last judgment at the end of history. In the intermediate state, the prayers of the living for the dead and the commemorations of the church genuinely affect the soul's condition. Prayer for the dead is not a futile gesture, it is a real act of love with real consequences. The communion between the living and the dead is maintained, cultivated, and efficacious. Connection po haligicity. The Byzantine understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead, ongoing, active, mutually supportive, maintained through prayer, commemoration, and the sharing of sacred food is one of the closest Christian parallels to the Haligric ancestor altar practice. In haligicity, the beloved dead are not gone, they have changed their mode of presence and remain accessible through the specific practices of the ancestor altar, photographs, offerings of food and water, regular address and conversation. The Byzantine koliva and the ancestor altar's offerings of food and drink express the same recognition. The boundary between the living and the dead is permeable, and the relationship across that boundary is genuine spiritual practice, not mere sentiment. Folk religion, magic, and the unofficial sacred. Alongside the official theology of the Church, Byzantine religious life included a rich and complex layer of folk practice, magical belief, An unofficial sacred custom that the Church both condemned in principle and accommodated in practice because it could not be eradicated and because it often served genuine spiritual needs. Amulets, charms, and protective magic. Byzantine people wore amulets of all kinds: bronze medallions depicting saints or angels, phylacteries, coral beads, blue glass eyes, and carved stones with magical inscriptions. These practices were condemned in ecclesiastical canons from the earliest centuries, but they were also practiced by clergy, monks, and the devout alongside their official piety. The line between a blessed object and an amulet was in practice very difficult to draw. The most pervasive protective magical belief in Byzantine culture was the evil eye, the belief that certain people could, intentionally or unintentionally, harm others through an envious or admiring gaze. Protections against the evil eye included blue glass beads, the gesture of the home, specific verbal formulas, and prayers. The Orthodox Church offered its own countermeasure. The priest could perform a specific prayer service for someone believed to be affected by the evil eye, thus incorporating the folk belief into the official ritual system. Dreams, visions, and divine communication. Dream incubation. The practice of sleeping in a sacred place in hopes of receiving a healing dream from a saint was an ancient practice that Christianity inherited from the pagan Asclepian temple tradition and maintained throughout the Byzantine period. The most famous Byzantine incubation shrine was that of Saints Cosmas and Damian outside Constantinople, where hundreds of miraculous healings were documented. These are not legend collections compiled centuries later but contemporary accounts recorded close to the events they describe. The illiterate, sophisticated authors who considered the events ordinary evidence of ordinary divine activity. Dreams were regularly used in Byzantine culture to receive divine guidance, communicate with deceased relatives, receive warnings of danger, and obtain spiritual instruction. The Church's position on dreams was nuanced. While condemning the use of professional dream interpreters, it affirmed that God genuinely communicated through dreams to those in a state of spiritual receptivity, particularly saints and those who had prepared themselves through fasting and prayer. Astrology, divination, and the boundaries of the sacred. Byzantine culture maintained a continuous and ambivalent relationship with astrology, divination, and related practices inherited from the classical Greek and Roman world. Imperial courts employed astrologers. The founding of Constantinople itself was timed according to astrological calculations. Almanacs predicting favorable and unfavorable days for specific activities circulated throughout Byzantine society. Fortune tellers, sorcerers offering love potions and binding spells, and practitioners of various divinatory arts operated continuously throughout the Byzantine period despite repeated ecclesiastical prohibition. The standard church answer was that the stars influenced, but did not compel. They created tendencies that could be overcome with prayer, virtue, and grace. In practice, many Byzantine Christians held both the official theological position and folk astrological belief simultaneously, without perceiving them as contradictory, both an approach to the sacred that Haligrisity will recognize. The fall of Constantinople and what was lost. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed's forces breached the walls of Constantinople after a 53-day siege. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine F. Palaiologos, reportedly removed his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets. The city that had been the center of the Christian world for over 1,000 years passed into Ottoman hands. The final liturgy. The night before the city fell, a final, extraordinary liturgy was celebrated in Hagia Sophia. The congregation, soldiers, clergy, civilians, the emperor himself knew it was likely their last. The service was described by witnesses as one of the most moving events in Byzantine history. The entire city present in the great church, singing the ancient liturgy in the face of what they knew was coming. Receiving communion as a community that would almost certainly be scattered or dead within hours. At the end of the service, the emperor embraced the patriarch, asked forgiveness of everyone present, and left for the walls. When the city fell the following morning, Mehmed rode to Hagia Sophia and ordered it converted to a mosque immediately. The altar was covered, the icons removed or plastered over, the mosaics whitewashed. The greatest church in Christendom became the greatest mosque in the Ottoman world and remained so until its conversion to a museum in 1934 and back to a mosque in 2020. What was lost and what was transmitted? The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was civilizational catastrophe. Thousands of manuscript volumes, the preserved texts of ancient Greek philosophy, science, mathematics, medicine, and theology were burned, sold, or scattered. Byzantine scholars who had been accumulating manuscripts in anticipation of the city's fall carried what they could to Italy, where their arrival helped fuel the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Plato, of Greek mathematics, of the entire classical philosophical inheritance that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries, while Western Europe struggled through its medieval period. The Eastern Orthodox Church survived under Ottoman rule. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople continues to exist in Istanbul to this day, though in greatly reduced circumstances. Russia, which had converted to Orthodox Christianity through Byzantine missionaries in the XIIth century, increasingly saw itself as the Third Rome, the new center of the Orthodox world after Constantinople's fall. Mount Athos has maintained continuous monastic life since the XIIth century, through the Ottoman period, through Greek independence, through 2 world wars, through the present day. The Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is still celebrated today in substantially the same form as it was in Hagia Sophia in the XIIth century. The tradition lives. Byzantine legacy and haligicity where the paths cross. Byzantium is not a closed chapter of history. Its theological insights, its mystical achievements, its understanding of sacred space and sacred time, and its vision of the human person as genuinely capable of divine transformation remain alive, and they speak directly to what haligicity holds as central: theosis and the divine human. The Byzantine teaching that every human person is called to genuine deification, real, lived participation in the divine light is the oldest and most thoroughly developed Christian articulation of what every tradition haligicity honors is saying. You are not separate from the divine. The divine is not outside you, judging and evaluating. The divine is the innermost nature of what you are, and the purpose of life is to realize that nature in every dimension of your existence. Theosis is the Byzantine name for this recognition. The liturgy as sacred ceremony. The Byzantine understanding of the divine liturgy as the entry of heaven into time, the moment when ordinary time is suspended and the eternal becomes genuinely present in the gathered community. The sacred space and the consecrated elements is the most completely developed ancient model of what the Haligric Book of Rituals is doing when it opens sacred space. Every ceremony, whether Byzantine or Haligric, operates on the same principle, that the deliberate, communal, embodied enactment of sacred form creates conditions in which the divine is genuinely, not merely symbolically, accessible. Hesychasm and inner stillness. The hesychast tradition's cultivation of inner stillness, the progressive quieting of mental activity until the practitioner rests in clear, attentive presence open to the uncreated divine light, is one of the most complete contemplative traditions in the world. The Haligric practitioner who works with breath, with the cultivation of present moment awareness, with the deepening of feeling before thinking is walking a hesychast, adjacent path. The Jesus prayer's coordination with the breath, the descent of awareness from the head into the heart, the aspiration toward a state in which prayer prays itself. These are contemplative technologies that converge with what haligicity cultivates in the feeling dimension of the tetrality. Sacred space and the church as cosmos. Byzantine sacred architecture's understanding of the church as the cosmos in miniature, with the dome as heaven, the nave as the earthly realm, the sanctuary as the divine realm, and the entire space as a threshold between time and eternity, is the Byzantine expression of what haligicity holds about sacred space generally. Every Haligric ceremonial space is a microcosm of the cosmos, the 4 directions honored, the above and below acknowledged, the center established, the threshold between the ordinary and the sacred marked and made permeable. The Byzantine Church and the Haligric ritual circle are built on the same cosmological principle. Icons, objects, and the theology of matter. The Byzantine icon theology that matter is capable of genuinely bearing and communicating divine presence, because God genuinely entered matter in the Incarnation, is the oldest and most theologically complete defense of what haligicity holds about physical objects in spiritual practice. Crystals, charged objects, the ancestor altars, photographs, and offerings, the Haligric use of stones all rest on the same foundational recognition as the Byzantine icon, that the material world is not spiritually inert, that specific physical objects can be genuine loci of sacred presence, and that honoring the invisible through the visible is a legitimate and efficacious spiritual act. Ancestors, the living and the dead. The Byzantine practice of ongoing prayer for and communion with the dead, the koliva, the commemorations, the belief that the relationship between the living and the dead is maintained and mutually beneficial is the closest Christian parallel to the Holy Greek ancestor altar practice. Both are grounded in the same recognition that death changes the mode of relationship but does not end the relationship itself, and that cultivating the connection between the living and the beloved dead is genuine spiritual practice with genuine spiritual consequences. The sacred calendar and living in Turkey. The Byzantine liturgical calendar with its 12 great feasts, its seasons of fasting and feasting, its weekly Sunday Pascha, its daily cycle of prayer, organized every dimension of Byzantine life around the terikitsas of the sacred year. This is the Byzantine expression of what the Holy Greek wheel of the year does, structuring time so that the practitioner is always living within meaningful sacred context, always oriented toward the next threshold of the year's turning, always participating in a hierarchy larger than their individual experience. Living within a sacred calendar transforms the experience of time from the neutral container into the living, meaningful hour. The both and approach to the sacred. Byzantine folk religions both and approach, official liturgy vs protective amulets, theology vs astrology, church prayer death's dream incubation, reflects the same non-exclusive orientation toward the sacred that defines haligrecity. The Holy Greek synthesis does not demand that practitioner choose between traditions. It recognizes that the divine speaks through many channels simultaneously, and that the spiritually mature person develops discernment about which channels are most alive for them rather than wholesale adoption or wholesale rejection of any single stream. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. The Prechal Trovanum Byzantine Biology with century Tsiv. What Byzantium built was not merely civilization. It was a complete, coherent vision of what it means to be human in a universe that is fundamentally sacred in which every dimension of existence, from the emperor's throne to the hermit's cave to the ordinary family sharing koliva at the grave of their beloved dead, participates in a single, divinely animated reality. The Byzantines understood that beauty is not decoration but truth. That ritual is not performance but genuine encounter. That the body is not the obstacle to the sacred but its proper dwelling place. That what we become through practice, and that the practice is the goal. Grand Rising. Personal Fueling Series, Halignicity Guild Productions, may 2026.